Who's allowed to migrate and who's welcome? I read a very impressive piece by Catherine Dauvergne some times ago where she basically says in this global village, in this global society, wealthy, educated people are universally welcome. And it will not make a difference whether if you have the right degrees or the right, well, whether you want to move to Australia, to South Korea or to Belgium, you will find it equally easy to enter these countries and to settle and to participate. The other side is who's not welcome, that's also universally, like uneducated people with low qualifications, who are but nevertheless not less needed. Now, that is interesting also with regard to Ukraine, because I think, and that's my last point if you allow me, I think everyone asks herself, himself at this moment, why is this influx of Ukrainian refugees since for 1 year, why is there so little debate about it? Why is there so little political reaction, pushback towards it, whereas like just some years ago, in 2015, we had an equal, maybe in numbers even fewer people would arrive from the Middle East. Why do we treat that so differently? And I would suggest that it's not necessarily, and I'm on thin ice here, but hear me out, it's not necessarily maybe first of all related to racism or to that you despise people coming from the Middle East. I think the initial reactions to this movement in 2015 in places like the Netherlands, but also Germany and everywhere, where refugees welcome, would prove my point that it was, but then something changed. The initial reaction to the influx of Ukrainians was of course one of shock and horror, because the war broke out very close to where we live. I mean, here in Romania probably even more so than in the Netherlands. I mean, everyone looked at the map and checked, like, so how far is this? Yeah? And I slept a couple of nights really uneasy, even though I was far away at the Dutch coast. So in that sense, but I still believe there's also something different, and that now it becomes legal again. I think we're witnessing for the first time a sort of field experiment. What happens if a humanitarian crisis occurs in a country that is proximate, has a land bridge, and has a visa-free travel arrangement before the conflict breaks out? Because of course now it would be utterly politically bad taste to change that. Yeah? So it won't happen. But it's a field experiment, because Ukrainians were allowed to come when they fulfilled the conditions set down in the Schengen border code, that they could prove that they have sufficient, and in practice it wouldn't happen because the numbers would be too big at the border. But these people, Ukrainians, were allowed to come. They didn't need a visa. And that separates them from Afghan, from Syrians, you know, that's different. They could drive across the border in their cars. They wouldn't need special arrangements. They didn't need somebody to smuggle them. They didn't need to sit at night on a dinghy to get to a Greek island. It's just proximate and legal, the entry. That's different. And then, of course, I think the activation of the Temporary Protection Directive and those regulations is all because deep inside we were aware there's nothing we can do. These people arrive, we have to accommodate them. And we cannot do it through the regular asylum system because they are already clogged to the maximum. Our administrations will not cope. So, that's the starting point for me. So not necessarily a discrimination based on where people come from, but the setting in which these influx occurs. And does that now bring me to say these two have nothing in common? There's nothing we can do between 2015 and 2023, 22. I think we are learning lots of lessons for other refugee movements at the moment. Because for the better or worse, the way Ukrainians enter and find their place in the societies, it somehow works. At least in the Netherlands, it works. The children go to school, the parents try to find work, and it seems to all kind of figure itself out without the massive intervention and policy restraints and effects on the individual that the regular asylum system in Western country has, by forcing people to live in a certain spot, to reporting duties, to this and that, you know? So in that sense, I think it seems to work, this sort of more liberal approach. Why not try that with other groups, whether it works as well? And from the side of policy, it's the last thing I will conclude with that. It also creates the chance for an effective return. Because already in the summer, the first things that Ukrainian refugees that I had contact with in The Hague themselves did, when it was possible, they went back. And why did they go back? Because they were not afraid that if it got worse again, which it did, they couldn't return to The Hague again. So there was not this keeping people locked because of the fear that if you leave, you would not be allowed to come back as a refugee, which is a very current and urgent fear for people that, let's say, come from Turkey, from places in the Middle East. So I leave it there. I know I more or less presented a bullet point list of things that I found very much in use of reflection. So I leave it here, and I'm looking forward to your questions and concern and ideas on the 3.5 points that I raised. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You not only mapped very well the main points and main issues, but also raised a couple of important aspects. And I will leave the floor firstly to Luciana to respond to some of them, especially that you were the one who gave the homework because Luciana thought of this topic. So I give you more assignment.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Moritz, for accepting this challenge. And I have to thank also Cărturești for hosting us, since we are still on holidays, on student holidays. We thought that this might be a better place to have a discussion, and also students who would like to join to have also another type of teaching experience, learning experience, whatever. So that was the point. But we thought about this theme more or less together. Also because it's something that is increasingly relevant for the political debates here, but there is very little discussion when it comes to expertise. And I'm very, very happy that you emphasize the fact that migration is not just immigration, it's immigration as well. And in fact, I'm a political scientist by training in international relations, and there we're no longer even talking about migration anymore. We're talking about population flows. So we are just moving. That's it. And as a political scientist, it was music to my ear to hear what you mentioned about the super diversity of cities and the cleavage that the polarization that is now going on between the urban and the rural areas, because that comes rarely from a lawyer, but also it's very rare to have it discussed in our policy circles, and we usually look only at the consequences and not at how the discourse, but also how the structural elements are shaping not only the discourse but interactions. And since we're coming from universities where actually there was no majority, we did our PhDs in universities where there was no majority, we are even more entrenched into this view. So it's worth sometimes to realize that our personal experience might not necessarily bias, but might enforce some of these observations and could make us see these things easier than others. So from this point of view, I recognize very much of our common trainings, even if in different fields. But of course, the most intriguing part that was part of your presentation was the thing on the field experiment, on the fact that the previous regime contributed to this, and I tend to agree with it. However, I think that we should not dismiss the racist part as well. But I fully agree that institutionally this is something that facilitated a lot. However, if you're looking at the visa-free agreements, to my knowledge, it was not a perfectly free agreement. So there were a lot of exceptions that were made by the governments. And this specific situation that is exceptional, where the conflict was more framed as closer to home, had also an impact, a significant impact on how politicians and decision makers in general approach the already existing legal system. Because, for instance, in the case of Syria, we had similar agreements in several European countries, but we were not prepared to discuss together the asylum rules, common asylum rules, and that led to a craziness in terms of political discourse, and countries that actually had just like 1,000 refugees from Syria. 1,000 is like a couple of classes and the polytechnics, okay? Nothing, it's a very, very small amount. It's a block of flats in one of the more of the crowdier neighborhoods.
In the Netherlands we have the example of imagine a pub with 150 people.
Imagine a pub with 150 people inside, and then one person enters. That's what we're talking about. That was the refugee crisis 2015 in the Netherlands. So yeah, it's you get the point.
Yes, but exactly in these situations, like in Poland, in Hungary, in Romania, we discussed about the refugees even if we didn't see anyone. So that's crazy, but it's very easy to explain from a sociological point of view, because usually it's what you don't know you fear. And this is something that we can see in other contexts of movement and of diversity. For instance, in Romania, which is a multi-ethnic country, the highest level of anti-Hungarian sentiment, with the Hungarian minority being the largest, is in the south of Romania, where there is no Hungarian population. Although some voted there for the Hungarian party. That's quite interesting in terms of electoral behavior and also electoral corruption. There are several elements here that I think in these discussions should be taken into account. I fully agree that the legal perspective from which we are looking at different regimes of what happened at the moment where the challenge occurred is extremely important, and I think it's a point that has not been raised enough in this debate so far, and publicly in Romania is basically a point that has never been made so far, and not in other neighboring countries either, to my knowledge. However, I think that we should take into account also the political dimension, particularly how the subject was exploited politically. In the case of the Ukrainian refugee challenge, it was so obvious who the bad guy was, and it is so obvious related to the survival of a security regime in Europe, then that is almost impossible to take far-right stance and win something apart from certain areas. So that's not politically viable. But the third dimension, apart from the legal and the political one, I think should be the social one. And here the way in which we relate to others is particularly important. And in this sense, racism matters, because these were white people, very similar in many ways, and what was presented in the media was mostly women with children. Whereas in the Syrian crisis, the media often presented men, young men, well, not so white, and with beards, more viral in this sense. So all the cliches about who is us and who are them. So I think this dimension should not be neglected. On the other hand, there is another issue that we tend to forget about migrations and refugees. If we use the terms migration and refugees, we often think about a challenge, a problem. And it's very little framed in terms of opportunity. And you are absolutely right about focusing on the super diversity and what it brings, and it is because it's more positively regarding the cities, but it's also because we realize what an opportunity it is. Mm-hmm. In the cities, we tend to find more people that understand that this is a huge opportunity. And here, I think we are going to have some future challenges in the near future in Europe, because some governments perceive the opportunity and some institutions perceive the opportunity and others did not. For instance, many universities, and I'm coming from a university, many universities, not only in Europe but across the world, headhunted Ukrainian immediately.
Oh yes.
Yes, and big companies headhunted immediately. That was a huge human resource that was eager to go somewhere else and to accept jobs, even if temporary. And that was a huge opportunity. But many companies didn't realize, and especially those in countries where the discourse us versus them, and countries where the discourse on migration has been always presented as a problem, are not aware of that. And they miss the opportunity. They miss the opportunity to have access to such a resource. And this resource will become increasingly connected, and it's already becoming increasingly connected. And also, even if there were not enough scholarships for students, they will have more opportunities. There are many more Ukrainian students at various levels in big universities than they have ever been, and there are increasing dual programs, and there are so many opportunities, and this will create a huge resource for Ukraine after the war ends and for the reconstruction. And the fact that some countries did not understand that will make them they will keep them out of networks of opportunities and also networks of future decision making. And with that, I'm closing, and here I'll pass the ball back to you, back in your courtyard, because what you mentioned actually is at the core of what we're debating right now on the at EU level on the reform of the asylum norms. And my question to you, and with that we're opening probably the question and answer, the Q&A part, is basically from your expertise in law and from your current knowledge on the topic and on the debates to which you have access, which is the direction in which you see the European Union going in this field, and whether the Ukrainian situation is also opening opportunities for some more positive reforms, or we are going to have a more temporary solution just to mend some of the holes, and that's it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Luciana.
reply to that.
The first one, the racism part, of which I didn't want to downplay, but it's just for me also, don't forget the other thing, is obvious when you see the treatment at the border of students from the global south that were in Ukraine and were caught in this whole nonsensical war, that they were actually left there while the Ukrainians could enter, and they were left at the border and said, no, you're coming from a safe country, or God knows what, go back to, and that was heartbreaking and cannot be dismissed, but yeah, we shouldn't push it away, but I think to a larger degree it was driven, the response was driven by realism, saying like we can't stop this anyhow, whereas probably the further away it is, the more you think, there is a reason that we can. Now, embracing diversity and the split in Europe, maybe a bit playing with fire again, but wouldn't those countries that are now missed the train in a certain way, would those not also be those who already lose their own brightest people to somewhere else? I mean, would that not be, and I'm, again, as I have close affiliation with Albania as well, that is partially because of course money and monetary incentives, but to a big degree also how people are treated in employment situations, and that just human resource management and the way you treat your employees is far more advanced. Also maybe the more diverse, the more empowered employees are, and this cleavage, this difference that will increase, I think is already quite drastic, and I sometimes wonder why countries resist change when they see they clearly lose out, but there must be other, I'm not studying this, I don't have the methodologies, but I scratch myself here and think like, don't you see what's going on? Why don't you react? Anyhow, where is the EU going? Now, I have two replies. The first one is, where can the EU go? And that is because of the political, the way the EU operates. We always we always are quick to say the EU does this and the EU does that, and it is the EU that failed. Whereas when I then look at the treaties and how all competences are divided and who takes what decisions under which circumstances, we should say the member states collectively failed, instead of blaming the EU. And this uploading of policies to the EU level when you don't like them on the local level, on the national level, and then blaming the EU for failures that are eventually your own failures is, I think, an excuse that is too easy taken. So in that sense, I saw how quick, after the introduction of policy of competences with the Treaty of Amsterdam for the EC back then in the areas of freedom, security and justice, how quickly the member states could agree on everything, blocking, sending people back, having an asylum acquis, all of these things were virtually in a couple of years we had them. And then it took until 2003 that we have a family unification directive and a long-term residence directive. Both items shouldn't be really controversial. And then until 2009 it took until we had something for highly qualified individuals, where you also think like, what on earth, everyone wants these people, what took you 10 years to get it? And only now we have also acquis for minimum. But when you see how they all are formulated, very little shall, which for lawyers indicate that member states must do something, lots of can. So if the member states think that they see fit to do something, they can implement it this and that way. So lots of facultative kind of provisions in these laws. So that's one thing. I don't know how that will pan out later, like how can the EU develop? And the second one is, and that's the good thing, why I'm positive, and that's very lawyery. As soon as a EU law in a certain field, you have set a minimum law under which the member states cannot fall. Even if you're unhappy about the EU asylum acquis, because you think it's unfair and doesn't treat, it is there and prevents people like Viktor Orban or the Polish government, or the German and the Dutch government, I'm not, or the new Swedish government, or the Danish are not really bombed, but that's another problem. But that prevents them from going under this threshold. And it's a justiciable one. You have a remedy. You can go to your local judge, and that judge has to enforce the European rule. So that is a strong norm. And then what I just said as a negative, how long it takes to negotiate EU laws, that is actually also a positive, because these things are not likely to change very quickly. So it's sort of set in stone. You see that the Dutch government for decades runs after watering down the family unification directive. It doesn't lift off the ground because the member states are like, other member states are like, no, leave us alone with that. It was such a hassle to get it there. We're not opening that can of worms again. So now we have these minimum norms, and they play out in practice. And lots of asylum seekers actually benefit from that. Lots of migrants benefit from that, and lots of populist national governments that would want to implement solutions like the Brits do now with flights to Rwanda and all kinds of other funny ideas are prevented from doing it because there's EU law. So that's this where I'm split in between this, I don't know whether it really moves on, and on the other hand, like what we have is actually pretty important and pretty influential already. Maybe not always visible, but in the background it is this minimum norm, almost like the ECHR, only higher, under which we cannot fall. So that's a good thing. And I like good things. So.
Before I open the floor for the Q&A, I would also want to highlight something and actually ask you a question. I was really, I don't know if happy, but I think it was very good that you mentioned this centrist view when we talk about the EU migration, that we forget about the Venezuela refugee crisis, the Myanmar one, that we should all talk about maybe with the same force. The fact that you highlighted the reactive perspective, it's always reactive, it's not so much proactive and constructive approach within the EU. And what I wanted to say also in relation to this field experiment, I do think it's a very good learning hub and learning situation. I would see some application in relation to the international global order. Maybe you would have your thoughts of it. I was thinking, as we had in the EU the temporary protective directive, that maybe the same regional approach could be a way to deal with the Venezuela crisis or the Middle East crisis and so on. Maybe it would be a model to be imported and used in other parts. I don't know what is your thoughts on this. And my question for you is, you talk about the 2015 crisis that made, we all felt that the migration situation was really heavy and urgent and very, but actually we had the concept of Fortress Europe way before. And we even had, and we still have this internal backlash. For instance, Romanians are still part of the Schengen area.
That's because of Dutch local internal politics.
So it's
I'm trying to fish for compliments here, but I really think it is.
So in a way, we still have this internal Fortress Europe. And my question is, why do you think we had it even before this clear crisis? And do you think they show some failure with their or missed opportunities with the EU values, the EU projects? Sorry, if you want first, or
Just very briefly, I think that legally you can expect something and it can go into institution from this model and that can perhaps be applied. But when it comes to such issues, the most important decision is political. Because any legal document ultimately is first a political document. It's a political agreement that comes to a certain form and format. When it comes to Venezuela, for instance, or Myanmar, I think the situations are significantly different. Also, what is happening with different centers of refugees in Africa, for example, or in Latin America, not only in Venezuela, we noticed of these cases, or in the Middle East. So I think that these situations are significantly different in terms of legal and institutional framework, acceptability of the topic. So when it comes to arriving to a political decision that could perhaps learn something from what we had to face, I have my doubts as a political scientist. But as a scholar, of course, I see the opportunity and I see that obviously an example from which we could learn a lot, but I doubt that we are going to learn very soon.
Thank you.
I hope I have sufficiently ordered my thoughts. About the first point, I recommend the book written by Diego Acosta on citizenship and constitutional forms of allowing migrations in South America, in which he in a fantastic way explains how a sort of free movement regime exists in South America, not because of the laws as we have in Europe from an outside organization, but from constitutional norms within the South American states themselves, which consider their populations to be somehow more fluid than we do, or I don't know where it comes from, but I listened to a presentation by him when he visited us in Leiden for a conference, and it was eye-opening, because apparently the whole thought of migration is a different one. I don't know whether it includes Venezuela, but I remember that he brought that up as one of the big challenges to that system, because of course a huge influx from one particular state disrupts the whole system as it was. But I recommend that you look at that, because it's really, also for you of course as well, super work and very interesting, because it's so different from what we know. Now, Fortress Europe. Now, such a long time we have it, yeah. Why? Because I think we have a sort of dialogue in the European Union where we separate very strictly between free movement on the one hand, the inside movement in a federalized, if you will, system, where I am to be treated equally with my Dutch colleagues, and I'm allowed to move and reside wherever I want as long as I'm not an unreasonable burden. You know, the whole lawyers talk about that. And the outside, which is the extracomunitari in Italian, the one that is not an EU citizen. So in a way we're mimicking, or we're having the same divide between a citizen insider and a non-citizen outsider, an alien that gets right, a citizen that has a right, rights, citizens have a right to have rights, to bring Hannah Arendt up in this discussion, and that I think we kind of have the same on the European level. Because we make the fundamental decision with Schengen in the 80s, with the treaty in Schengen, that we wanted to remove borders on the inside to facilitate our free movement. And the logical consequence of that was that we needed to agree on the protection of the outer border. That was a lot, and it's not always protection is a wide field. It just basically means that Finland doesn't give a visa to somebody Portugal doesn't want. There has to be some sort of, agreement on that. Otherwise, it doesn't work. Otherwise, member states would never ever agree on it politically. And then, of course, once you create this insider discourse and the outsider discourse, I think policies will conform to that. And then it's always about protection of the outer border, and that increases, becomes like this self-fulfilling, that the whole discourse is toward this is inside, that is outside, and we have to protect the outside. It can't be enough, because there will always be a problem, there will always be leaks, there will always be, irregular migration. So, yeah, I think it's a logical consequence of Schengen eventually. And Fortress Europe, also Europe is not really different in this, no? We have Fortress America, we have Fortress Australia, Fortress Japan, probably, not really because it's an island, but Fortress UK now, as they are playing their own little game again. So yeah, Fortress South Africa, in relation to the states around it. So every island of development on the global scale has this tendency to build a fortress and protect itself from those who are outside of the circle of happy few. But in Europe, for me, it started with Schengen, that we needed these policies and they then reinforced each other over time.